Hello, my name is Jared Rubin. Thank you for having me. This is a talk about my book that's forthcoming in the United States at the first week of May, May 9th, entitled How the World Became Rich, The Historical Origins of Growth. It's co-authored with Mark Koyama, an economic historian at George Mason University. I myself am also an economic historian at Chapman University in Southern California. And this talk is going to be both about the book, but also about the statement in the title, or really the question in the title: how did the world become rich? This is a book that offers multiple theses for this gigantic event that began approximately 200 years ago. It first summarizes numerous theories that have been put forth in the last few decades of this now rather large literature, focusing on various features such as geography, politics, and political institutions, and institutions more generally, culture, demography, colonialism. One thing this book does is it notes that none of these theories by themselves can explain everything about why the world became rich. One would not expect this to. This is a very, very long run process that is extremely multi-causal. Now, of course, some causes are more salient than others. And one thing this book tries to do is to understand which of those causes are the most salient, and much more importantly, how they interact with each other. Right. So we want to know things like, well, why did the Industrial Revolution begin, when and where it did? It's not an obvious question, right? Or the answer is not obvious, at least. Britain by no means was an obvious place for the modern economy to emerge as late as, say, 15 or 1600. There were many other parts, both of Europe as well as other parts of the world, that would have been much more likely candidates. Why did it happen, when and where it did? Then we also ask, why did some countries such as the US and eventually places like Japan, and in the 20th century, places like South Korea, Taiwan, why did they eventually catch up? Why did the rest of Western Europe catch up? Why did other places not catch up? These are all questions that are, on the one hand, inherently historical, the answers to them at least. We have to understand all of these features I noted before. Geography might play a role in at least explaining why some countries have been able to either take off or catch up, or are on the process of catching up. Same with politics, same with culture, same with demography, same with the colonial past. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some of the key points of each chapter of this book using figures. This book has a lot of figures in it. I'm not going to go through them all in this book or in this talk. If you'd like to see more figures, of course, the book's available. It's not overly expensive. I think by the time many of you see this, it will be available in the United States. Again, that day is May 9th, 2022. And so why don't we begin? So the first chapter, what we do is we try to overview the various questions. So, the world is rich. Some parts of the world are certainly richer than others. We know that many millions still live in poverty. We're not cold-hearted. We're not foolish. We understand that not everybody in the world is actually rich. That is not the point of this book. However, the world is much richer than it has ever been, and it continues to grow richer with each passing day. So understanding why, when, how the world became rich is, and in my opinion, at least, one of the most important things that economists can do. It has the potential to impact all of those, a billion plus people still living in dire poverty. If we can understand not just how certain parts of the world became rich, but what was unique about the way that those parts of the world became rich as well, because it's not one thing that, not to spoil the one of the big upshots of the book, but one of the real lessons I think you can take from this book is that there is not one path to to growing rich, for a nation to grow rich. There are many paths, and the most likely path for a country to take is dependent on its history. It's dependent on its cultural past, its institutional past, things like this. All right, so what do we mean by just how rich the world is? Let's look at this figure. So this figure shows us countries that were richer in 2018 than Great Britain was in 1800. As you can see, that is most of the world. Of course, there's a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, which obviously has gone through a terrible few decades, North Korea, but most countries in the world are richer than Great Britain was in 1800. Why is this important? Well, here's the thing. Britain was the world's wealthiest country in 1800. So, Mark and I believe, while we certainly have a long way to go, this is a massive achievement. And to think that, when we think about Britain around 1800, via entertainment, via novels, things like this, we often do think of a society that is at least growing richer. Well, most of the world's richer than that now. Now, of course, this is again, not just to say that not all of these countries are richer than Britain. And another thing is there's obviously significant disparity of income within countries as well, meaning that there's plenty of poor people in all of these countries that are lightly shaded gray here. This is not to say that these people obviously should be left behind either. But one thing that has very clearly happened is as the world has become richer, most of the people have been pulled up with it. There is still a long way to go, but understanding how we got there is really important. And also understanding that most of this wealth that we can see, to some degree in this slide here, has happened in the last 2 centuries. Now, it's not just that there's been a reduction in absolute poverty as the world has grown wealthier. More and more of the world has moved further from the edge of subsistence as well. So this is a big difference. So on the one hand, you have what you might call, absolute subsistence, where you're barely making enough to make ends meet. This is the lot of about 1 billion people today. And it's in a sense for those billion that in many respects we wrote this book. The world has largely moved away from that. Much of the rest of the world has become much wealthier. So, we can take for instance, the relatively arbitrary milestone of $10 per day in US dollars. All right. This is hardly enough to make one rich, right? This is $3,650 a year. However, in most economies, it is more than enough to afford the basics of life. We think, in most economies, especially poorer ones, most of the basics, at least, are also cheaper than they are in places like, the United States or Western Europe. So this figure that's being shown here shows when each country reached this milestone. This represents a level of security that has been unknown throughout human history. We see that obviously some countries, and certainly the countries that were highlighted in the last slide, have not reached it yet, but many have, and many have been there for a while. This is, again, a massive achievement that prior to 200 to 300 years ago would have been relegated to a very small set of elites, maybe some kind of merchants and high-end producers, but for the most part, very few people would have lived on $10 a day in world history. All right, so on the surface, the answer to the question, how did the world become rich, is simple. In the past 2 centuries, the world has seen more economic growth than the rest of human history combined. Now, we care about economic growth not because it's an end in and of itself, but because it's the key to alleviating the type of poverty experienced by almost everyone who has lived prior to 1800. And really, again, as I've now noted a number of times, still plagues way too large a share of the world's population today. I think in everyone's ideal world, this figure that's still up here would have every country at well above $10 a day. This is something that is absolutely something to strive to. It's something that would be one of the the most important things the next generation or two of people that especially want to help the developing world can possibly do. Now, how do we get there? So modern sustained economic growth, and the key here, this is a key word that I'll be saying a few times, is sustained. Modern economic growth is sustained. So throughout history, there have been a number of periods where there has been some degree of economic growth. There's what is known as the commercial revolution in Europe, for instance, between the years 1000 through 1300. There's the Middle Eastern Islamic Golden Age between the 7th century and 10th century. Song China had spurts of economic growth. The Roman Empire had spurts of economic growth. The issue with all of these spurts of economic growth is they weren't sustained. They were subject to reversals. And because of this, there was no modern, what we would consider massive continuous growth in the economy. All right. Because of these reversals, we have not seen, we did not see a takeoff until the last 2 centuries. It's the last 2 centuries where we have seen the real takeoff. And as this figure suggests, this is a very famous kind of figure that we readapted for the sake of this book. Once this takeoff started, it continued unabated. Even you can see something like the Great Depression is barely registers in here. So this is just per capita income, per capita GDP for a number of regions, from about 1 to the present. As you can see in this figure, between the year 1, Jesus was walking the earth, and 1800, nothing. There's nothing. Now I should be clear, these data are subject to some debate in terms of how valid they are prior to about 1800, in that some believe that there's a lot more fluctuation, and I think that's almost certainly true. That said, the main point here is not really debated, in that there was very, very little economic growth prior to 1800. And then in the first few decades of the 19th century, massive takeoff. And as you can see here, it begins in Western Europe. North America eventually takes over, led by the US and Canada. And then it eventually spreads. And as you can see, it's starting to spread to other, to places that remained poor in the 19th and even into the 20th century. China being the biggest by far in terms of both economic growth, but also most people. It's slowly spreading to South Asia and the Middle East as well. So these are what is known as the hockey stick figure, because it looks like a hockey stick turned on its side, is among the most important figures, I think, in all of economics, because this helps frame the question. All right, and that's what the goal of this book is. It's to bring together this many social scientific theories on the origins of modern sustained economic growth. We believe this is a massive issue with really important implications. And for this reason, very, I think, unsurprisingly, it's been the focus of many great minds. Almost all of the theories that we overview in this book that try to understand this figure right here, focus on generally one aspect of growth. Again, the ones we'll be looking at here are, geography-based explanations, cultural-based explanations, institutions, colonialism, demography. And what we do in the first half of this book is just classify these. We bring these theories together. We say what the main insights are of these theories and overview them. And we try to do it in a dispassionate way, meaning the way that we would think that the authors would want them presented themselves. All right, so that said, most of the theories on the origins of economic growth are concerned with just pushing one side of the debate. So as a result, less attention has been given to how they're connected. That's what a main thing we do in the latter half of this book. So a phenomenon as important and as widespread as the origins of modern economic growth, certainly not monocausal. So in the latter half, this is precisely what we do. We first assess some of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the major arguments, and then we lay out the ones we find most convincing. Now, in doing so, and one thing we actually had not even anticipated before writing the book, but became very clear to us as we were writing the book, is that most of these causal channels interact with one another. Culture impinges on institutions. Geography and demography affect how both culture and institutions affect economic growth. Society's colonial past has a long legacy affecting all sorts of socioeconomic outcomes, and so on. So what we do then is to build, a really complete account we do focus a bit on Britain in the latter half. And this is, it's the home of the Industrial Revolution and ultimately the first country to achieve modern sustained economic growth. Now, also to be clear, these two things should not be thought of as one. Modern sustained economic growth does not happen until the first few decades of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution happens in the mid-18th century. So we do have to connect the dots there. It's not just that Industrial Revolution leads to modern economic growth. In doing so, we are then able to kind of pull back, take from those first 6 chapters and say, well, what were the preconditions that made sustained economic growth possible in Northwestern Europe? And another thing that comes out of this is it's not just Britain. The Dutch Republic, modern day Netherlands, also had fairly significant growth even prior to England. So why? Why there? Why not other parts of the world? Why not China? Why not the Middle East? Why not Southern Europe? Italy was well ahead for a very long time. We then ask the flip side of this question. What I just noted. Why did sustained economic growth not first happen elsewhere? We then go into the Industrial Revolution, as you'll see in a second here, and then we connect it to economic growth. Because while I said Industrial Revolution and modern sustained economic growth are not the same thing, they are connected. Without industrialization, it's highly unlikely you get modern sustained economic growth. All right, we then end by exploring some of the most convincing explanations, linking these to these broader sources of sustained economic growth that we cover in the first half, and then bring it all together to show what happened beyond Britain. How did this spread to the US? How did this spread to China? How did this spread to other follower countries, Japan, other parts of East Asia, Western Europe, places like that. All right, so I'm going to try to take you through, somewhat quickly here because there are 10 chapters. Through each of these chapters, give you a flavor for the types of arguments we discuss in here. All right, so let's start with geography. So this is an attractive thesis. Did some parts of the world become rich because of their geography? And what we mean by this, climate, soil type, access to coasts, mountains, things like this, things that might either help trade, prevent trade, help technology spread, things like this. These can all contribute to productivity and trade. The question is, what role did they play in triggering modern economic growth? Now, probably the most well-known insights in the broader field of what we call the geography hypotheses are those of Jared Diamond. So in his classic Guns, Germs, and Steel, he argued that factors like the relative length of continental axes. So let me take you there. So not that. Let's see. So something like this. So we see that the North American axis goes northwest, Eurasia goes north-south, Eurasia goes east-west. He argued, and I'll get back to the others in a second, that things like that, the disease environment, proximity to the equator, access to coasts and rivers have a tremendous influence on long-run economic prosperity. But then we ask, is this fate? Are locations with good, quote unquote, geographic characteristics just destined to become more developed? Can also ask the same about the Industrial Revolution. So what role did Britain's geography play? It's a large island, for instance, off the coast of Europe. It's endowed with a somewhat moderate climate, numerous rivers, a long coastline. How did this help shape not just its economic fortunes, but things like its political institutions? There were also abundant coal resources. What did this play? How did this affect early industrialization? Could this be why Britain industrialized first? Oops. All right, so one important factor or example, rather, of a geographic factor that we cover in this book is disease burden. Now we'll get to this. Countries in what is known as, say, the malaria belt in sub-Saharan Africa, as you can see, this is a figure we note here by country, its risk of someone catching malaria. So this continues to be a reason. And there's been studies such as by the well-known economist Jeffrey Sachs that would suggest that this continues to be a reason why parts of Africa continue to be underdeveloped. Malaria is a disease that's killed probably more human beings over human history than any other disease. The burden, though, is not just on health, it's economic as well. All else being equal, countries where a higher proportion of the population were affected that were affected with malaria had growth rates, like 1.3% lower than other countries. 1.3% is more than most economic growth rates in human history. It's only very recently that any country has grown above 1% per year. So one might say that if you were to really extrapolate this back in human history, this could account for nearly all of parts of why sub-Saharan Africa have not succeeded economically. Now, of course, the effects of things like malaria go well beyond the economic. These places also have higher infant mortality. And, with the economic, they also have lower investment in physical and human capital. If it's likely that you're not going to survive that long, or, if life expectancy is low, investing in things like capital is not always a wise investment. You should consume in the modern day than your present. All right, so this is just an example of a geography-based explanation. The disease environment is certainly, it's a geography-based thing. So we highlight this in many other examples to point out the attractions and limitations of arguments based on geography. Now, by far the most attractive aspect of a geography-based explanation are that they have the advantage of being what economists and there's social scientists call exogenous. This just means that it's not affected by other variables of interest. Geography is what it is. It's been around, at least through humans' existence. It's mostly been constant. So as such, we don't need to worry about geography being the result of other factors that were also important for economic growth, such as culture institutions. Now, geography might affect culture and institutions, but it's unlikely that it's going to go the other way around, unless you consider stuff, man-made stuff like dams or, bridges, things like this. So these geographic explanations, then they can potentially provide a straightforward explanation for economic growth and poverty. Now, the big problem with geographic explanations is that they're largely unchanging. Why is this a problem? Well, in one thing that is a very robust finding is that there has been massive reversal of fortunes throughout economic history. So, for instance, explanations relying solely on geography cannot easily explain why the Middle East or China was much more developed in the year, say, 1000, just 1,000 years ago or so, than Western Europe. But by 1800, Western Europe was far ahead. Things like geography have a hard time explaining this. The geography is not changing. So how do we get such massive reversal of fortunes? That said, this hardly means that geography has played no role in the economic fortunes of many parts of the world. So Jared Diamond's hypothesis, laid out in Guns, Germs, and Steel, provides multiple reasons why geography might have mattered. So for one, as we note here, the relative height and length of the Eurasian, African, American continents may have played a role in their economic capabilities. So I mentioned this before, the reason here is vertically aligned continents like North America and South America, the Americas, as well as, he would argue, Africa as well. They contain numerous microclimates, which limit the spread of crops, domesticated animals, and even people. After all, crops suitable for the rainforest are unlikely to grow in the savanna or mountains. So domesticated plants and animals of, say, Mesoamerica did not spread to Peru or the Amazon basin. Perhaps more importantly, as this figure I briefly showed you before would note, is that technology and the spread of knowledge spread much more easily horizontally than vertically, since climate characteristics vary less. So these arguments have received empirical support, as we see here. So Pavlik and Young find that, and this is where these data come from, technologies moved much more easily between east-west neighbors than they did north-south neighbors. So you see here, this is technology adoption levels in 1500. Eurasia dominates here. These are technologies that are very close to the frontier. So most of the countries in Eurasia were near the technology frontier, and as well as North Africa. So we think of this, especially north of the Sahara, Europe, Asia, as this kind of east-west axis, whereas these other places with north-south axes, Africa, south of the Sahara, as well as the Americas, much less technology adoption. All right, and there is just a purely geographical explanation for this. All right, so we continue in this chapter by overviewing various other geographic features that contribute to economic growth or lack thereof, including mountains, rugged terrain, coasts, and climates. And these features can have an important influence on economic outcomes. They affect trade and trade routes, agricultural productivity, cultivatable land, propensity to engage in warfare. All right, so this can be overcome, as we note, and then we'll note later on in the book as well, by infrastructure. So, transport infrastructure can matter for economic development to alleviate what we might call the curse of bad geography. This could include roads, turnpikes, bridges, a whole host of things. Canals being a gigantic one. So the Grand Canal in China, for instance, built 1,400 years ago or so, connected North and South China and allowed for grain to flow between the two. The question is then, why do some states invest in infrastructure and others do not? When are states even capable of investing in such projects in the first place? So this question suggests that overcoming bad geography may require institutions capable of developing such infrastructure. This gives us a hint at where we're going in this book, namely that a lot of these theories interact. So bad, quote unquote, bad geography can be overcome by institutional developments that encourage development of, say, infrastructure. All right, so let's move on then to institutions. So can institutions explain why some parts of the world are rich? And what we mean by institutions is political, legal, economic, religious, these institutions, those landscapes of those historical societies that help shape economic incentives. They differ across societies, and maybe that can help explain why some parts of the world became rich and not others. And unlike geographic explanations, they can change over time as well, meaning that they can possibly explain reversals of fortunes. All right, so in this chapter, we're now in chapter 3. This chapter helps explain the literature on institutions. Specifically, that's gigantic literature on institutions in general. We specifically focus on those asking these big questions. So the real big institutional literature starts with the Nobel Prize winning economist Douglas North, and in terms of at least what we think of as the modern institutional literature. There had been an institutional literature for well over a century prior to North, but he really kind of brought it back and then brought kind of modern economic analysis into the study of institutions. So North eventually, even though not initially, when he initially started thinking about institutions, by his very well-known 1981 book, Structure and Change, he came to the view that there was no process analogous to the competitive market to select the most efficient institutions. So institutions themselves might last for a long time, even if they're not efficient. This is kind of an important insight that he came to. The incentives in the political sphere differ from those in the marketplace. We can't think of institutions like we think of market activity. So as I just noted, inefficient institutions can persist for decades or even centuries. And such institutions can be the source of lasting poverty, which is why it's so important to the questions asked in this book. They also might be a leading reason why some countries are rich and others are poor, right? So for instance, one key component of institutions is the degree to which they permit economic freedom. The more economic freedom a society has, the more individuals are free to allocate their resources as they see fit. Economic freedom is also closely associated with the rule of law. So as we can see here, this figure shows just a correlation between the rule of law and per capita GDP. While such correlation should not be taken as causal and face value, there's a gigantic body of research suggesting that there is indeed a causal relationship between the types of institutions that facilitate rule of law, such as those that constrain executive power, and per capita GDP. And this is a very strong fit, as you can see on this figure. All right, secure property rights are another key aspect to economic freedom. They ensure that individuals earn a return on their investments. Property rights are also related to the rule of law, where people have confidence that the government will enforce contracts and property rights. More economic transactions are likely to occur. However, the rule of law varies immensely across the world. Thought I was going to put that on there. I guess I didn't. So is this a reason why? Oh, I do. Okay. So this is the rule of law index. Is this a key reason then why some countries are wealthy and others are not? right? As you can see, I mean, we're just going by deciles here, but this is consistent, with what we think of as the wealthy countries are generally lighter shaded here, right? The places with the strongest rule of law typically are also wealthier. All right, again, we need to make these causal connections, and we overview in the book why these relationships might be causal. So legal systems also vary tremendously across societies. So, on the one hand, you have very small scale societies that rely on like informal and decentralized legal systems, up to very large scale societies that have very complex legal systems. All right. There's been a very large recent literature that argues that the rule of law and the type of legal system that society has played a critical role, specifically in the rise of Western Europe. It did so by providing a check on the power of government, guaranteeing that each individual their own private sphere of non-interference, and often they offered really a platform for stability as well. And stability is key to long-run economic growth. Then the question is, where does rule of law come from? There's always a part of the onion we can peel back. It's not always, there's always an underlying reason. So what we're trying to do is get at some prime movers here, which is why, going back to the last chapter, geography is such an attractive explanation, is that it's kind of the outside of an onion, but is it the onion? All right, so to give one example of a relatively influential literature is there's a very large literature on the legal origins of a society's legal system. So this is Laporta et al., very famous set of articles, argued that English common law tradition is associated with better protection of property rights, less onerous regulations, more favorable environment for markets than systems that were based on Roman law, such as the French and German legal systems, the civil law. In particular, they argued that property or protection for investors was systematically stronger in common law countries. And so you see here the legal origins throughout the world. Now, most of this is due to the colonial origins of these economies, which we'll get to in chapter 6. But again, as you can see, it's not a one-to-one correlation here, but places with English civil law or English common law, at least as their origins, tend to be economically better off. All right, this is one of the I think key relics of the colonial era, which we will get to in chapter 6, as one of the reasons why places with different colonial origins tend to do differently. All right. There are many other institutions that shape historical growth, though, not just legal institutions. Perhaps most importantly, the political institutions of a society shape how we act. When the state has something close to a monopoly on violence, it can use force, or at least the threat of it, to incentivize people to act in a certain way. Political institutions vary widely, and there's now a large literature that suggests this is one of the leading causes and consequences of differences in economic development. So social scientists have come up with multiple ways of studying, analyzing, and classifying these institutions. One very well-known one, especially in political science, is what is known as the polity score, which measures countries more or less on a range from absolute autocracy to absolute democracy. So the darker in this figure you see here, the darker the score, the more autocratic it is. The lighter it is, the less autocratic it is. Again, fairly straightforward correlation here, at least, and again, even though there's plenty of reason to think this is causal, with places that are wealthy, well off. All right, so after we discuss why institutions might matter, we do proceed to discuss some specific historical episodes. These include things like the economic and financial institutions that emerged during Europe's commercial revolution, medieval European guilds, the rise of parliaments, limited governance, and the growth of Europeans' fiscal capacity. That's the ability to collect taxes. All of these things have been studied recently and have been argued to be really important for the rise of certain parts of Western Europe. All right, what I want to do now is get into another aspect that is related to institutions, but is also very different in this, namely, is culture. So there's been a number of recent explanations that suggest maybe it's culture that played some role in the long-run economic trajectories of various societies. what we mean by this are things like racial norms, ethnic norms, gender norms, the importance placed on education, which you might think might be quite important, especially for 19th and 20th century growth, religious values, trust, especially trust of outsiders, family structures. You have a nuclear family, a large extended family is considered the base unit. Incest taboos, which there's been a small literature but growing literature on as being somewhat important. How do these affect economic outcomes? Why do they vary across societies in the first place? So what we do in this chapter is summarize this rapidly growing literature, and it is very rapidly growing, especially even just in the last decade, on the various ways that culture has shaped the modern economy. So to be clear, what we mean by culture is the way it's used by cultural anthropologists. They view culture as a set of learned rules of behavior. These are kind of the shortcuts we use to make sense of a complex world because our brain power is limited. It's not, we are very much not putting forth explanations that were common in the first half of the 20th century that had some kind of Eurocentric cultural explanation that there was something about European culture that was just better. It's not what we're doing here. So why might culture help explain how the world became rich? So to answer this question, I think it's also important to think about the converse. What part of culture might have inhibited economic development? These learned norms that and beliefs that we acquire through cultural evolution develop slowly, often more slowly than economic and technological change. So cultural beliefs can become maladapted to their economic environment. All right, so this can be a reason why some parts of the world fell behind. So for instance, there have been many societies that have had cultural values that were in a sense against work and profit. So for instance, the ancient Greeks and Romans thought that work of any type was among the lowest valued of pursuits. Wealth was valued because you wanted to become wealthy so you could go live in a villa and live a life of leisure. It was not, there was no real value in work. The middling classes had little prestige in these societies. This is not a type of cultural norm that is going to lead to the type of developments we saw in the 19th century, where it was ingenuity, it was technological developments and getting your hands dirty that really mattered. Religion is another big one. So, perhaps the most famous argument is Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism in this, guys. It's over 100 years old. According to Weber's hypothesis, is this Calvinist doctrine of predestination that encouraged people to work hard and save more. This is how they could show they were one of the elect. And so the thing is about Weber's hypothesis is there is a correlation, as you can see here, between the spread of Protestantism and the spread of economic growth. Protestantism strongly and positively correlated with per capita GDP. The correlation is positive but weaker in Catholicism and negative for Islam. But is the causal explanation correct? Did Protestantism, and especially Calvinism, actually cause economic growth via some capitalist work ethic or something else? Or is this just a cause of correlation does not mean causation? All right, now to be clear, there have been several critiques of Weber's thesis in the century since it's been published. We discussed these in this chapter, but don't have time to go through them here. If it was not work ethic, though, what might have helped these Protestant countries grow faster? Because again, there is a correlation. Is it causal, or it could be just completely spurious, though? And so this large literature kind of focuses on schooling, political economy, bureaucratization, among other things that are more associated with Protestant states than non-Protestant states. Other religions also might have played a role. So there's this old 20th century canard that there was something about Islam that retarded economic development. Now, I think, so as does Mark, and I think the literature in general thinks that these theses are pretty hard to swallow. There is, as can be seen on this figure, a negative correlation between the presence of Islam and economic development. This may be true over the last few centuries, but this hasn't always been the case. During the golden age of Islam, 4 centuries, more or less, 7th through 10th century, the Islamic Middle East was far ahead of Christian Western Europe in terms of wealth, technology, science, architecture. So it's hard to accept theories that just blame some attribute of Islam or, frankly, Christianity, but do not explain the Muslim advantage and why it's been there for centuries. Now, of course, this doesn't mean we should automatically discard theories that look at some aspect of Islam. In fact, a recent literature looks at the role that Islamic institutions played in economic development of the Middle East. So again, what we're getting here, as I've noted now a few times, is this confluence of various explanations. You have cultural, in this case, or religious, and institutional explanations. So these include, most famously, the work of Timur Quran, the role of Islamic law, and the role of religious authorities in legitimating political rule. These theories tend to not focus on a specific tenet of Islam, or frankly any other religion, but on how religion was institutionalized. Now, one thing that this literature, and a very robust finding in this literature, shows is that culture can affect economic growth because it persists. A large literature has emerged in these past 2 decades showing various ways in which culture persists and what this means for economic outcomes. As these studies focus on things like family structures, civic participation, individualism, gender norms, trust norms, and so on, that, so we have something here, this is a very strong and positive correlation between people who say most people can be trusted and per capita GDP. Again, making the causal connection and the causal story is a very different thing, but there's very clearly a correlation. All right. So one thing that happens is these cultural features arise in the distant past, often for reasons completely unrelated to current circumstances. However, they persist in a changing world and still affect economic growth today. Even after these cultural traits that emerged are after the reasons they emerge are long a thing of the past, they still tend to shape the outlook of their descendants. So for this reason, culture tends to interact, and this is going to be a key of the latter half of this book, with other determinants of long-run economic development, such as institutions and demography. All right, and why don't we get to one of those now? Let's look at demographic explanations. So was it just a matter of families having fewer babies? This kind of goes back to the most famous, arguably the most famous explanation for why economic growth took so long, that of Thomas Malthus, which I'll explain in a second. So what role did demography, family structures play in the path to modern riches? Are controlling birth and death rates, the age of marriage, child mortality, are these the key to unlocking modern riches? Life expectancy would be something else. And why do they differ across societies? So even in the poorest parts of the world, life expectancy, and this kind of goes back to some of the stuff we're talking about at the very beginning, are much higher than they were a few years ago. So for instance, in 1703, the beginning of the 18th century, life expectancy in England, which was about the wealthiest country by then, it's actually the Dutch Republic, but England was very close by that point, life expectancy was 38.5 years. This is pre-industrial England. This isn't just about people getting sick because of industrial pollution. It's pre-industrial England. In 2015, no country in the world had an average life expectancy less than 51 years. Now, of course, 51 years, I think by modern eyes is still way too short. And of course, we agree that one of the things we hope to push forward on this is thinking about ways to expand wealth, which will lead to greater life expectancy. But still, the point is, the average life expectancy in even the country with the lowest life expectancy in the world is 12 to 13 years more than it was in one of the countries with the highest life expectancy a few centuries ago. All right, so what changed? Might these changes have affected economic growth? So for most of history, families had few children, a few of whom would make it to adulthood. So these conditions led to Thomas Malthus. So he was writing in the end of the 18th century as England was industrializing, to famously conclude that this was the permanent condition of humanity. So he reasoned that most people would not be able to eke out much more than the subsistence living. So when he was writing in the late 18th century, he wasn't wrong about the human condition up to that point in time. The human condition for the last million years really was like this. His ideas relating demography to economic development explain much, and not almost everything, about the pre-industrial economy, but they cannot account for the incredible transformations in the human condition that have arisen in the last 2 centuries. So what changed? That's one thing we discuss in this chapter. So we do consider the theories of Malthus and consider the extent to which the world he envisioned aptly describes the economic realities of our ancestors. Then we ask, all right, well, why did some parts of the world first moderate and then escape the forces that Malthus highlighted? What features made a transition from a Malthusian world to real modern economic growth possible? In particular, how did demographic change lead to investments in education, human capital, and how did these investments further economic growth? So there are a number of ways to look at this, what happens after there's a big demographic shock, for instance. So we study, or we have an entire section on the Black Death. One of the things that many introductory to economics, principles of microeconomics professors tell their students is like, look, if you have a massive shock to the population, like you had with the Black Death, which, at least in Europe, killed 1/3 to 1/2 of the population, you expect wages to rise because there's a massive shock to the labor supply, right? We show that, the historical literature does suggest that that happened, but also there were a lot of other things associated with this we go into in this book. Don't have time to really get into this here, but this would be an example of a massive demographic change that did lead to structural economic change as well. All right. Other types of things that are important, some of which we save for later chapters when we consider interactions, and probably the most important demographic change is what is known as the demographic transition of the 19th century. This is the transition that moved to both lower birth and death rates. Family sizes became much smaller. This was very important for both kind of escaping the Malthusian trap of, when you have an economic shock that leads to more income temporarily, you just have more babies, and those babies end up eating all those economic gains. Having smaller families helps escape that. There were plenty of other important demographic differences across the world prior to industrialization as well. One, for instance, that was mainly relevant to Northern Europe was late marriages. So this is called the European marriage pattern, where women ended up getting married older, and in doing so, they ended up having less kids, because the best predictor for the number of children one would have in the pre-industrial world was the age of marriage. Essentially, once people got married, they tended to start having kids, and while the woman had the capacity to do so. All right. So prior to the modern period, female age of marriage was important in determining aggregate fertility. So as one thing we can see here, for instance, is this isn't about fertility so much as it is about population, comparing it to wages, right? As you have a higher population, you have lower wages. Lower population, as we see here with the Black Death, higher wages. So going back to fertility, since fertility within marriage remained high, aggregate fertility was delayed by delayed marriages. And this is something that we see in these data that kind of does start to shift in England a little later in this period. But for a large time in the medieval period, even well after the Black Death, birth rates remain low, suggesting a possibility that this might have been something that led to structural change that eventually led to institutional change that helped England ultimately take off. We consider these theories here. All right. I think I should move on. So the next set of explanations have to do with colonization. Between the 15th and 20th century, it's a small group of European powers colonized much of the world's landmass. Right. So these are, as you can see here, this small set of Northwestern Europe, the dark ones are the colonizers. The medium shades are those that are colonized, which is, again, much of the world's landmass. And certainly if you were to include Russia in there as a colonizer, it would be much, much more of the world's landmass, because you would not just get the large country of Russia, but all of the former Soviet Union. The resources colonizers extracted have long been thought to have played a key role in their economic rise and the relative economic decline of the rest of the world. So can colonization explain why some parts of the world became rich, why other parts did not? Now, the most common explanation is exploitation. So, the colonial powers exploited the natural resource bases of their colonies, including precious metals from South America, rubber from the broader Congo region, spices and sugar from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, oil from the Middle East, and most importantly, slaves, mainly from sub-Saharan Africa. Theories that rely on colonization attempt to both explain why Europe became rich first and why much of the rest of the world has been slow to catch up. So one thing we do is we see, do these explanations survive scrutiny? Colonization was certainly brutal and extractive, and its legacy is still with us in many ways. But was it responsible for modern economic growth? One does not necessarily lead to the other. And what we do in this chapter is overview these connections that are made or not made in this literature. All right, so it certainly differs by where you look. So for some countries, the period of colonial rule was short and transitory. For others, it was long-lived. Right? Europeans had a negligible impact on East Asian societies like China and Japan until after 800. So it's kind of hard to see how colonization had a negative effect on them prior to the big divergence between Western Europe and the rest of the world. So arguments that look at this have to mainly focus on the benefit of empire to Europeans, not those other parts of the countries falling, or those other parts of the world falling behind. On the other hand, with respect to Africa, Latin America, the colonizers certainly benefited from the resources of and the slave and coerced labor provided by the regions. Meanwhile, the regions fell further behind due to colonization. So some arguments focus on the role of the colonies in slavery in Britain's industrialization, for instance. In fact, the slave and coerced labor that the role that it played in Britain's industrialization has been the source of heated debate for decades, if not longer. And this is an important debate, and it's one we discuss in this chapter. A large literature has also emerged on the effect of the colonization on the colonized. Some parts of the world clearly ended up pretty well off that were colonized: the U.S., Canada, Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, while others remain poor, such as sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. What accounts for these differences? So of the many odious aspects of colonization, one of the things we do focus on, because it's been a focus of the literature and certainly an important one, is the slave trade. And so between 1400 and 1900, Africa experienced four slave trades: transatlantic, trans-Saharan, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean slave trade. Now, the colonial powers were the primary participants in the transatlantic slave trade. They brought over 12 million slaves to the New World. Most of these slaves came from the west coast of Africa. So we can see in this figure here, this is where slaves were taken from in the transatlantic slave trade. And finding, especially those of Nathan Nunn, have found that people enslaved still fare worse off today on several economic and political outcomes. There are many reasons pointed to this in the literature, including lack of trust of outsiders, ethnic fractionalization, weaker state development, things of the sort. So it's also institutional based. So these places tend to have weaker institutions. Now, the type of institutions that colonizers established also had an important legacy for the economic and political development of the formerly colonized world. So where extractive institutions were established, the rights for the native populations were limited, if they existed at all, and investments in public goods tended to be restricted to those that facilitated extraction, such as roads, like leading from mines to ports, that where the colonizers could get those goods to the ports to be shipped back to Europe. Now, unfortunately, many of these post-colonial governments found these extractive institutions useful as well. So as a result, these institutions often persisted even after independence. This is one of the reasons why, quote unquote, bad governance in terms of checks and balances and freedom secured is more common in the formerly colonized world than in Western Europe. Works focusing on colonial institutions, most famously those of Ashimoglu, Johnson, Robinson, seek a comprehensive answer for why large variation in contemporary institutional quality and economic outcomes occurred in the former colonies. So we discuss this literature, which is now rather large. So one thing that this literature certainly notes is on net, the effects of colonization on the colonized were almost certainly negative. Colonization, however, did bring a few benefits, even in those places that remain relatively poor today. There is some evidence that wages grew quicker in places that were colonized, especially by the British. There were greater investments in education, health facilities, and other types of infrastructure. We discuss this in this chapter. We should say, though, that this literature by no means claims that colonization was a good thing for local populations, and we certainly do not claim that in this book either. It does point out, though, that history is rich and complex. Economic consequences of colonialism were highly heterogeneous. It was very bad in some places, especially places that are seen on lighter shades on this map of Africa. Less bad in others, and maybe somewhat positive in a few others. Appreciating these nuances, I think, is important to gaining a better understanding of how colonization contributed to modern wealth and the distribution of wealth. Now, this is a summary then of the first 6 chapters of this book. The latter 4 chapters of this book, which I will not have time to get into in this talk, bring these theses together. They think about how, particularly, and what we end up focusing on are how institutional and cultural explanations go hand in hand oftentimes, because culture helps shape institutions, which help shape economic trajectories of many societies, particularly the way that Northwestern Europe eventually became wealthy. So, I can take you through a few more slides and then we'll conclude this talk. So this is a slide that shows real per capita income in a few select countries, the two big ones being the Netherlands and Great Britain, between 1450 and 1700. So on the eve of industrialization. One thing that's key from this is that, when compared with, say, China, look at Great Britain and China. In 1450, more or less the same per capita GDP. But even by 1700, there was already a divergence. So this is prior to industrialization. Industrialization begins in the 1750s. The question is why? Why Northwestern Europe in particular? Because the two leaders here are the Netherlands and Great Britain. At the beginning of this period, it's Italy. Italy was where the initial kind of post-Rome, there was a long spell after the fall of the Roman Empire. Europe reemerges in approximately the late 10th century, early 11th century. Most of this is happening in northern Italy. Eventually, though, the modern economy does not happen in northern Italy. So there's two things that need to be answered here. One is why Europe rather than other parts of the world. The second is why Northwestern Europe, because this is not a pan-European thing, the rise of the modern economy. So what we do in chapter 7 is look at some of the preconditions that start to emerge in this period. These are political, they're cultural, to some extent colonial, but not as much. Certainly, we look at some geographic explanations. The Netherlands, largely underwater, they had to overcome these solutions. How did they do this? And also demographic. We mentioned the European marriage pattern. What role did all of these play, and how did they interact? We then move our focus to Britain, because Britain is where the modern economy begins. It's also where industrialization begins. This figure shows specifically, it's very similar to that hockey stick graph I showed at the beginning, but specifically what's happening in Britain. Now, there's two things I think of note here. One is that GDP and GDP took off beginning with industrialization in the latter half of the 18th century, but particularly in the 19th century. The other thing, though, is that per capita GDP was much slower to take off, meaning that how it actually affected people, individuals, this takeoff was much slower. Part of this, as you can see in this figure, is due to population growth, right? So it was also a matter of obtaining population growth that eventually led to rises in per capita GDP. Thus, demographic explanations play an important role. There was the demographic transition that I mentioned before that Britain had to go through. Now, one thing that's really key here that we study extensively in chapter 8 on Britain's Industrial Revolution is the role that technological progress plays. Understanding the growth of the modern economy is impossible without understanding the massive transformation in the rate of innovation. The rate of innovation takes off and has not abated since. It is still going even stronger in the 21st century. Of course, the locus is no longer in Great Britain. To some extent, it's in the United States, but it's all around the world as well. There are many, many countries that have a very high rate of innovation, which means that any type of economic advancement is not petering out. All right. So this gives you an idea. It's the same idea. GDP per capita, even as GDP per capita eventually starts to rise. Now we're getting in the 19th century, real wages slower to take off. Again, same idea. It's a matter of demography. All right. One thing that does happen in this period, and you can kind of see it towards the end, is that there is a transition that occurs, and this transition is demographic. So eventually, by this very end of this period here, the birth rate starts to go down. Death rates are also going down. Again, this is the transition to the modern demographic regime, which does permit greater economic growth. It means that those Malthusian processes where additional babies are just taking up all of the additional advances in income are no longer happening, and the additional advances in income are actually being spread to the broader population. This was something that we note then is not just true that was happening in England. It was also happening, and this is now moving into chapter 9 when we're looking to see how this spread to the rest of first Western Europe and the United States, but then eventually elsewhere. We see this is not just something that's that's an English thing. It's the demography has changed in much of the rest of Western Europe as well. All right, so we then move on to start explaining other parts of the world, not just Britain. One place is the United States. The United States begins to take off, and we attempt to see if those preconditions that were so important in Northwestern Europe are also shared by the US. And for the most part, they are. And it's not, in a sense, not surprising, culturally, somewhat similar. Institutionally, a lot of the institutions were transplanted. And at some point in the 19th century, but particularly in the 20th century, the US takes over as the world's economic leader. In this case, by far, it's an industrial leader, but on almost every other outcome as well. And that's one thing we discuss, is how this happened and why this happened and what those preconditions in those first 6 chapters can tell us about other parts of the world as well. We then, in the final chapter, take this to understanding the spread of the rest of the world, the spread of the modern economy to the rest of the world, what we call what the literature calls catch-up growth. This is something that, in some countries very clearly, with the East Asian tigers, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, took off in the mid 20th century. Now, they didn't need to reinvent the wheel. They were able to take a lot of what had happened in the wealthy parts of the world at that point. But we also then look, well, why did these parts of the world take off and not other parts? We look at these institutional, cultural, geographic, demographic, even colonial factors that we know from the rest of the literature did play a role and try to understand what happened. All right, so we then look at India, where it took off much slower and is still there's way too many people living in India that live in poverty. And it's, on the other hand, it's one of those places, we believe, along with sub-Saharan Africa, that perhaps in our lifetime, and hopefully in the lifetime of our children, if not in our own lifetimes, these numbers that we see here will decline dramatically. There's plenty of reason to believe, as long as certain things don't happen. Obviously, climate change is a factor that makes it hard to predict with any type of certainty what will happen, but there are reasons for optimism that we go over in this chapter. We do discuss the East Asian tigers. We also discuss China. Now, China is, I think in many ways the most important case, because it's 1/5 maybe of the world's population, right? And the recent takeoff of China has been much more important in almost every respect for the world becoming rich than what really happened in Europe. Now, we need to, of course, understand why certain parts of the world became rich first, to understand how China could even possibly become rich in the way it became rich. But the key lesson here is that each part of the world has become rich in its own way, but there are a few general lessons we can take. So one thing we want to say, is, and I think to conclude, is that, in many respects, the developments that we overview in this final chapter, where we look at China, have contributed much more to the world becoming rich than anything that happened in Britain or the US. These countries that became rich first, and also you can add, Western Europe to this, they hold a relatively small share of the world's population. So for the world to become rich, it's necessary for the riches to spread. And this is really what, in a sense, this book hopefully gets at, because in a sense, we don't really care as much about the US becoming richer or UK becoming richer. We're much more concerned with it becoming spread to the rest of the world that is really not rich today, and especially those parts of the world that are highly populated, meaning we can really alleviate much of the world's suffering by having the spread. First and foremost, this of course means Asia, which holds around 60% of the world's population. And to be very clear, we know there's a long way to go. And the path is even much more fraught in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Latin America, and parts of Central and South Asia than it is in the parts of the world that have already either made the transition or beginning to make the transition. But we want to leave you on a positive note. There's been real, tangible progress, not just made in the last 200 years, but even made within our lifetime. The world is becoming richer, and we have every reason to believe that this will continue. And all of these numbers that look so positive, even as it seems the world is falling apart, there's real tangible progress that has been made in terms of alleviating some of the worst types of human suffering. And one thing we really hope to get out of this book is an understanding of how this came to be. All right, I think I will leave it here, and I thank you for inviting me, for listening to this talk, and I hope to have a conversation with many of you in the near future. Thank you.